Evening, everybody. Currently in the news, you may have heard about an object called 3I Atlas. It's an object that was discovered in July 2025 that arrived in our solar system from outside the solar system. Now, the I in its name means interstellar, and the 3 means that it's only the third known interstellar object that we've ever discovered. There's a lot of speculation about it, with many people making doomsday predictions, alien contact, all sorts of stuff like that. Now, there are a lot of anomalies that are associated with it, such as the late discovery of it. It should have been visible sooner. It's changed speeds drastically. The composition of it's weird. The speed of it is just outrageous. The tail is facing the wrong direction for most comets. Um, it entered our solar system at a speed of 140,000 miles per hour relative to the sun and was only 325 million miles from Earth. Now, all of this makes many people recognize a similarity to Arthur C. Clarke's book Rendezvous with Rama. Now, the current trajectory has it coming nowhere near Earth, but there have been indications that another object that's potentially 100 times larger than 3I Atlas has joined itself to 3I Atlas, but that may just be anomalous readings. There are some very prominent and legitimate scientists who have speculated that it may be of alien origin, and every day I see new podcasts with speculations about the object. The only thing I want to say about it here is that it probably is just an object that's passing through, as the initial observations suggest, although the anomalies are very interesting. But if it does turn out to be something more, it's not aliens from another planet. It would be demonic in origin for many reasons that are too much to go into here because we have other matters to attend to at the moment. However, Pastor Chuck Smith did believe that if so called aliens ever presented themselves, humans have been conditioned to believe in their reality. Therefore, most of humanity would be deceived. Now, I can't say I disagree with him on this. It's important to not be deceived if such a thing were to happen. In other words, if little green men show up saying they're from another planet, they're not from another planet. Now, I don't think it's going to be anything like that. I think it's just going to be a big object that's going to fly through, and then that's the end of it. But these things are within the realm of possibility. Now, we're going to be back to our regularly scheduled programming now, which we've been looking at, which is the return of the Nephilim. And we started looking at a woman who rides the beast. But James 3:4 says, Behold, all the ships, which though they be so great and are driven of fierce winds, yet are they turned about with a very small helm, whithersoever the governor listeth. In other words, the person that's steering the ship, wherever they want to go, that's where the ship goes. Galatians 5:9 says, A little leaven leaveneth the whole lump. Matthew 15, verses 13 through 14. But he answered and said, Every plant which my heavenly Father hath not planted shall be rooted up. Let them alone. They be blind leaders of the blind. And if the blind lead the blind, both shall fall into the ditch. And then Acts 17, 11, verses 11 through 12. We've looked at this a few times before. These were more noble than those in Thessalonica, in that they received the word with all readiness of mind and searched the scriptures daily whether these things were so. Therefore, many of them believed, also of honorable women which were Greeks, and of men not a few. In other words, you're supposed to investigate anything that I say. Now, last week, we started looking at the role the Catholic Church structure plays in Revelation 17. I want to reemphasize that this is not against Catholics in general or even against the Catholic Church itself, but it's about the structure that can be controlled by a small group, like a rudder on a ship. Now, I don't agree with Catholic doctrine, obviously, but as long as the person is a believer in the Lord Jesus Christ as a personal Savior, then we're in the same family. This is not against Catholics. Now, before we begin to look at specifics, when you think about a small group affecting great change on such a large organization, you have to ask yourself a few questions like, how can a small group do this? Also, why would people blindly follow this small group? Also, why would a group want to do this? There's a lot of questions. We're going to look at these three, but there's a lot of questions you can ask about this. Now, how such a small group can do this is probably the easiest part to answer, taken from history. It doesn't take that many out of a group to affect a revolution of any sort. It could be a good reason or it could be a bad reason, but it doesn't take many people. I would present the first American Revolution as an example of a positive revolution in which the founding fathers threw off the yoke of oppression and tyranny and they seceded from England. Do you know how much of the population actively pursued that? It wasn't most of them, it was 3%. If you ever see people wearing a shirt that has a 3% logo, you've probably seen somebody wearing that or something like this right here. This is what this is referring to. The 3% that affected a revolution for liberty is trying to be inspiring to people. It takes about 1% of the population to get an idea going, and when it reaches 3%, that can be the catalyst, particularly when the majority of people are willing to blindly follow whatever happens. Now, if more people care, if you can get it to 10%, then that's a tipping point. And that's what happened in Nazi Germany. And most people didn't want to do anything difficult to resist what was going on. As long as they had an easy life, they didn't care. But about 10% of the population of Germany actually wanted Nazism. Those who did resist were too few in number to stop things. Most people didn't care. And then those who did resist, they themselves were often victims in the long run. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who you may have heard of, he's an example of that. And I may be mispronouncing his name. I don't do German. Sorry about that. But if the majority of the people are actively involved in whatever's going on, if a movement can get to 25%, not even a majority, that's a tipping point that will affect change on the entire group in almost every case. For social changes in which the majority of the group is participating, 25% is the normal number. For example, when they started passing laws against sexual harassment in the workplace, about 25% of the people vocally supported those laws. Now, that doesn't mean the other 75% oppose the ideas, but they may not have considered it to be a major enough problem. For example, they may not have thought it was a common enough situation that needed new laws written about it, or they may have understood that getting the government involved in it was a bad idea. This is just simply a popular idea, even if it's not a majority idea. And this idea gets enacted or changes to existing social situations happen with 25%. So 3%, 10%, 25% depends on the issue. It still doesn't take a majority. With the Nazis, it's worthy of study that goes a lot beyond the scope of what we're going to do here. It's thousands of pages. We're going to skim over some of it here just at the high points that relate to the study here. But we know that those who were in power in the Nazi regime were demonic. They worshiped the false gods, the Golden Dawn, and they got power and knowledge from that. We've looked at that in the past and what happened to them and where they went after the war. However, for the average person in Germany, it was a social movement based upon hard times, and they wanted to do something about the bad situation. Nobody started out with, I want to kill Jews and other undesirable people. It was simply, the economy's bad and we need to fix it. If you read transcripts of Hitler's speeches, they're inspiring and patriotic, talking about the plans to fix the economy. Now, those fixes were all left-wing failed programs, but there was nothing overtly evil in those speeches. Mussolini and Stalin, they were concerned that Hitler was going too far to the left because even they recognized that their utopian schemes had limitations. When the United States government played Hitler's speeches, if you didn't understand German, you thought he was a raving lunatic. A German friend of mine once pointed out that if you don't know German, then if somebody says, oh, what a beautiful butterfly in German, it makes them sound angry. So it was like he was giving these great speeches about fixing the economy, and he sounded like a lunatic if he didn't speak German, and nobody spoke German. Not many people. But his speeches were not overtly evil. They inspired people. When the bad stuff started, and it didn't start with killing the Jews, but when the bad stuff started, they were already past the tipping point because the Nazis had the power. They already had the power before they started doing the bad stuff, so you either went along or you suffered. When the death camps started killing people, there were indications that the prisoners were starved because there was no food. Then somebody came up with the idea of putting them out of their misery, and a majority of Germans simply stood by and watched it happen. And as proof that the German leaders were either insane, demonic, or both, a rational, an evil person who's rational, evil but still rational, would have fed them and put them to work doing stuff for them instead of destroying them. Instead, they spent a lot of resources on killing these people, millions of them. That took a lot of work to kill those people. It was evil, a lot of evil work. That's what the Soviets did. They put people to work in the gulags and made them work off their sentences, and their sentences were often just simply contrived to put them in the gulags to provide cheap labor. Now, those things are easy to explain. They're wrong, they're evil, but they're easy to explain. The ones that take more scrutiny, the ones that you need to look at a little bit closer, those are the revolutions that use a very small number of people in a population to affect change. How does that happen? Well, first, you have to get a group with a shared vision. That vision may be good, or it may be evil, or it may be neutral. Exodus 23:2 says, "Thou shalt not follow a multitude, or you not follow many to do evil. Neither shalt thou speak in a cause to decline after many, to wrest or pervert judgment." In other words, don't follow people blindly to do evil. The Bible warns us against following the crowd, and it says the many. It doesn't even say the majority. Most Christians are biblically illiterate, and they're not capable of discerning right judgment from wrong, and they simply go with feelings and emotions. And in today's society, and most people are not Christians, although many non-Christians still have basically a Christian worldview. Even from the pulpit, there's very little discernment. For example, go back to Nazi Germany again. The Lutheran preachers, which was the official church of Germany, but the Lutheran preachers taught the mistaken notion that we are to blindly follow the rules of the government. Therefore, the idea was instilled in the people that it was God's will for these things to happen. God does have a purpose for everything, but sometimes that purpose may be judgment, or it may be to give you an opportunity to do good. Nowhere does the Bible teach us to blindly follow an evil government. We're to follow God, even if that means death. But what about the 3%? How does that happen? So you have to take like-minded people and you have to ally them with one another. You have to have common ideas. They have to be allied in a common cause. And in the past, it was often done in the dark of the night where the government officials couldn't see you. Oftentimes, pamphlets were used. I would encourage you to read those pamphlets because they will give you a lot of insight into the political environment of today. They're available for free online, and I've linked to a bunch of them below and below the video here. But today, we have the internet and social media to link like-minded people together, or in some cases, to bully groups to agree or remain silent. That's not always a positive thing there. As a matter of fact, usually it's probably not a positive thing. But it's important to remember that social media and the internet is just a tool that is neither good nor bad in itself. But the people who use these tools, they may be good or they may be evil. Now, the first American Revolution is a great example of this, which had good results, although our modern world has lost that edge. The French Revolution is an example of an evil outcome of this. The French Revolution was atheistic in nature, and it was a source of our modern terms for left-wing and right-wing politics, and the left-wing won and destroyed many people. Even the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia that formed the Soviet Union only had the support between 5 and 7% of the people, and that movement ended up murdering millions of people. Now, there's no reliable numbers on the Chinese Communist Revolution, but today the people almost unanimously approve. They approve or else they die, which is a common tactic among tyrannies. Interestingly, if a revolution can be presented in a peaceful way, it is 3 times as successful as violent protest. In other words, pamphlets, speeches, word of mouth, peaceful protests are a lot more effective than trying to violently overthrow anything or anybody. Now, the thing about it is that when things are controlled by between 3 and 7% of the population, that minority can only maintain control through brute force. Therefore, the citizens have to be disarmed, and all liberty has to be destroyed except for those who are the elites. Which brings us back to the Ephesians 6:12 paradigm that tells us that the government oftentimes is the problem. Even in America, slavery only had the support of between 3 and 5% of the population, but that 3 to 5% had all the power and had most of the money. Therefore, slavery existed for a long time, and slavery is still a thriving industry in Africa and parts of Asia where money and power determines what is right and wrong. 3 to 5%. That's all it takes to control a power structure. Now, what we've been talking about so far, we've been looking at political power. But we need to keep in mind that in the past, the Catholic Church was a major political power in Europe. It even had the strongest army in Europe at one point. And that's because the power structure had been taken over by the wrong people. They gathered enough support to get things past the tipping point. They took control, they perverted that structure. These are the Jesuits for the most part. When we're going to be looking at more of their history shortly, we're going to try to roll about 1,000 years of history into about an hour next week. But first, why do so many people follow these leaders blindly? Sam Keen said the word courage should be reserved to characterize the man or woman who leaves the infantile sanctuary of the mass mind. In other words, courage should be used for people who think by themselves. Have you ever looked, if you're in the United States, at the American public education system, or most public education systems for that matter, the ones I'm familiar with? Most of the education systems in the Western world no longer teach, they train. Training is a good thing. You need to be trained for skills, but school should be teaching. A pigeon can be trained. But these schools, when they train, they instill an instinct for blindly following the rules and directions of those in power, never questioning or else. Keep your eyes in the back of the head in front of you, or else you're going to be in trouble or whatever. With my kids and grandkids, I expect obedience, but I will tell them why we do things in a particular way. God does the same thing for us. He doesn't simply give us a list of rules to see if he can trip us up. He gives us guidance on how to live successful lives as individuals and as a society as whole, and he tells us why. Most people in their minds may disagree with political agendas or government mandates or other ideologies, but they still comply. They don't want to argue. Oh, nice people don't argue. They don't want to be seen as an outsider. They want to be accepted. Most people have been trained to do what they're told, and they're completely politically correct because you don't want to offend anybody, and they will justify their behavior by saying, "Oh well, what can one person do about that?" Most people simply want acceptance, and they don't want to be seen as rocking the boat. But when you do that, you're a part of the problem. Perhaps you agree with the mandates and ideologies, in which case you're at least taking a stand. It may be a wrong stand, in my opinion, but you need to take a stand. You may not have an opinion. You may not be able to determine what is the correct stance. And that's not the same thing as not taking a stand. Not taking a stand is when you know right from wrong and you don't stand up for what's right. And by not taking a stand when you disagree or agree, you're a coward and you're part of the problem. And God has nothing good to say about cowards. Revelation 21, 7 through 8. He that overcometh shall inherit all things, and I will be his God, and he shall be my son. But the fearful, this is the word for cowardly. That's what fearful means. They're cowards. But the cowardly and unbelieving and the abominable, the detestable persons, the murderers, the whoremongers, these are sexually immoral people, and sorcerers. This word is from pharmakos. It has to do with enchanters, and it always involves mind altering drugs. But the idolaters and all liars shall have their part in the lake which burneth with fire and brimstone, which is the second death. Nothing good at all about cowards. And this list is referring to people who are guilty of all sorts of things, including being a coward. There are two ways to sin. commission, and omission. A sin of commission is where you actively do the wrong thing. You're a liar. You're a whoremonger. A sin of omission is where you don't do the right thing when you know the right thing to do. You're a coward. When Satan first showed up in the Garden of Eden, what did Adam do? Nothing. He was passive. Passive men are a huge problem in the world in general, but specifically within the church. This is capital C church, the church as a whole. Society has torn men down, and they call anything manly toxic. And there may be such a thing as toxic masculinity, but even that's better than a weak, passive, and cowardly man. But the world teaches that anything masculine is toxic. We need to be building up men in order to be a blessing to the women, the children, and the world in general. But those who are in power understand that masculinity is the only thing that stands between them and taking over. Everything. They want to take over everything. There's only one thing that can stop them. Strong people, not cowards. Weak people build nothing. But weak people allow everything to be destroyed. G. Michael Hopp, in a novel, stated it very succinctly. He said, hard times create strong men create good times create weak men, and weak men create hard times. It's a vicious circle. This is where we are today. Our good times have created weak men, actively, not passively created. Our society is actively trying to turn men into being weak and cowardly. Society has taught that men are inherently bad just for being men, not in a moral sense of all people are sinful, but masculinity is evil. But that masculinity produced from hard times is what created the good times, and now those weak and cowardly men are allowing hard times to destroy. Men have been avoiding marriage, they've been avoiding responsibility, and it has wreaked havoc on society. They still make babies, but there's no commitment, and the surest path to poverty is single motherhood. It just passes from one generation to the next. There's a problem. I was reading some statistics on this recently, and I'm going to do a separate video on this subject eventually. But one of the problems in Western culture today is that most pregnancies are not within the bounds of marriage. And the marriages that do occur end up in divorce a majority of the time. The last number I saw was 80% of marriages now end up in divorce. And because of this, many people avoid marriage in order to avoid divorce. They simply live together without the benefit of marriage, then they end up separated anyway, and the children suffer. Why? Why is it this way? Because most people who get married come from broken homes, so they don't have a role model of what marriage is supposed to be, and society tells them the wrong thing. They don't have a moral outlook on masculinity and femininity because they don't have that role model. And the local churches should start a premarital counseling system sometime in childhood about what a family is supposed to be. People say, oh, but preacher, we can't talk about things like that to children. Well, if you don't talk to children about things like that, guess what? Their schools and society are going to talk to them about things like that, and they're going to give them bad information. It's not going to be in any kind of godly or moral way, and our children will have only a perverse view of the way things ought to be because you're not giving them the positive message. How many people do you know who have called off an engagement? Do like most people, very few. You may know one or two, but very few people call off an engagement. But how many people do you know who have been divorced? Think about it. If we don't teach our children, then the wrong people are going to teach them. You say, oh, but I've been divorced. That would be hypocritical. No, it wouldn't. Hypocrisy is do as I say, not as I do. Biblically, it's called playing the actor. Do as I do and not as I did. It's not hypocrisy, that's experience. There's one national media figure who has been married 4 times. He said marriage is supposed to be forever, but I failed. He recognized what it should be, but he also recognized that he failed. He didn't try to justify it. You can't undo an action. Once it's done, it's done. But that's experience. Now, if his attitude was different, that would be hypocrisy. But we can't know his thoughts. We can only know his words and his actions. So if you failed, you can admit wrongdoing and still point the right way to others. That's obviously not an ideal situation, but you work with what you have. There's a prominent preacher who is in Harlem, and I follow him. He's interesting to listen to, but he was a convicted robber and a thief, and he turned his life around in prison. That's part of his testimony. He'll go talk to people on the street, say, "Look, I've been where you are, and it's wrong." Now, his life is scrutinized. People are going to watch for him to trip up again. But he can say, "Don't be a thief," because he has that experience. This is not hypocrisy. He has that experience. Now, if he were preaching to not be a thief while he's being a thief, that would be hypocrisy. The Bible uses adultery as a type. And if we don't teach what adultery is, there's going to be no context for this. Yet one time I was teaching at a church and I was asked to stop teaching on spiritual adultery because that was not family friendly teaching. Well, I hate to tell you, but reality is not always family friendly. However, you don't have to be graphic about it. You can explain it without photographs and details, but you still need to teach. And if you don't, somebody else will. But in the Bible, cowards are condemned. We have to stand up for what's right and for what's moral. God tells us what is right and moral, but yet we shy away from standing up for that. And as with so many things, I'm not advocating that you go get yourself fired from your job tomorrow by getting in people's faces and telling them they're going to hell. But when they come around to put the rainbow flag on your desk, you have the option to let them do it, or you can say, "That's not going on my desk." After decades of the decline in masculinity, today's young men are once again interested in getting married and raising a family. That's a positive note. But they don't have the role models to assist them in that. And that's what we should be doing within the church. Uh, Charlie Kirk, who was assassinated recently, was a very public example of a positive role model for that. And therefore, they had to silence him. A coward will hide, but others have stepped up to continue what he was doing. I admire those people greatly. They're being godly, they're not cowards. How are you supposed to act towards your wife? If you've never seen that in action, you're not going to know. Therefore, somebody needs to demonstrate it. How does a woman act towards her husband? If you don't have the role model, you're not going to know. If enough people have the courage to stand up and speak out for what's right and against what's wrong, we can slow down the way things are going. For those who are cowards, your part will be in the lake of fire. You yourself may be saved, though it's through fire, but your part, your rewards, will be burned up. 1 Corinthians 3, verses 11 through 15. For other foundation can no man lay than that is laid, which is Jesus Christ. Now, if any man build upon this foundation gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, stubble, every man's work shall be made manifest. For the day shall declare it, because it shall be revealed by fire, and the fire shall try every man's work of what sort it is. If any man's work abide which he hath built thereupon, he shall receive a reward. If any man's work shall be burned, he shall suffer loss, but he himself shall be saved, yet though as by fire. Once the men start worshiping, they lead the way, things will start changing. And I'm talking about manly men, not girly men. Don't wear skinny pants around me. I don't keep quiet about that. But when somebody leads the way to put up the good fight, then others are going to follow. 3%. That's what it takes. And this is the way to lead the church as we go into the dark times that are coming in a positive manner. Our world is filled with cowards. Our churches are filled with cowards. They're afraid of persecution. They're afraid of being made fun of. And some of them are afraid of the offering plates being empty, so they water down the message. Some are afraid of confrontation or conflict. Oh, I don't want to offend anybody. Why not? What would Jesus do? Whipping people, calling them names, and flipping over tables is well within the realm of possibilities for that. But people, by nature, want an easy life, and that's going to lead to a hard life. To refresh our memory on this passage, he that overcometh shall inherit all things, and I will be his God, and he shall be my son. But the cowardly and unbelieving, and the detestable persons, and murderers, and sexually immoral, and Sorcerers and idolaters and all liars shall have their part in the lake which burneth with fire and brimstone, which is the second death. God gives us a long list of people who are going to be in for a very hard time in the age to come. Do we see these things going on in the world today? I would say that they're dominant. The world's full of them. Where are the men? When the Bible tells us to fear not, it doesn't mean that we're not going to feel the emotion of fear, but we're going to do what needs to be done anyway. And I pointed this out before. If you don't feel the emotion of fear, you're probably a psychopath. Everybody feels fear. But what fearing not means, it means that you have the ability, you have the courage to say, okay, this is scary, but I'm going to do what's necessary anyway. If we do that, we will show that He is our God and we can be His sons and daughters. Cowards will not have that honor. They will forever remain children, not sons. There is a place in the coming kingdom for cowards, and that place is not ruling and reigning with Jesus. Where's your heart? Is your heart with Him, or is your heart with the world? Are you a coward, or are you courageous? Do you follow the path of least resistance, or do you follow the hard path of righteousness? Why do so many people just simply follow directions from so-called authority figures? A lot of this is psychological. In the 1950s, there was an experiment done in which a test subject was shown two cards. On the first card was a single line. On the second card, there were three lines, A, B, and C, with C being the same length as a single line on the first card. The test subject had to state which line was the same length as the one on the first card. A simple question, right? It was obvious that C was the right one. Part of the setup of this test is that there were 7 other people who were supposedly taking the test at the same time. They were posing as test subjects, but they were actually part of the test. And they all stated that B was the same length as the line on the first card. The real test subject, instead of sticking to the obvious answer that C was correct, 37% of them went along with the rest of the group. It was obviously wrong, but they went along with it anyway. They had other tests than this to go along with this. That was just one of the questions on there. And they had 123 test subjects that took this whole battery of tests. 2/3 of the test subjects went along with the group at least once on the other questions. 2/3 of them. They could see a right answer. They knew a right answer, and they went along with the crowd, even though they knew it was wrong. 2/3. Remember, it takes 10% to let this happen, and it takes 3 to 5% to make it happen. Simply put, most people are going to conform to what others say and do, no matter how false or absurd those things are. To most people's minds, conforming takes precedence over adapting to reality. Romans 12:2 says, and be not conformed to this world. Most people do want to conform. It says, be not be conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. It says, be not conformed to this world. This world is full of absurd and irrational things, especially today. This world is full of lies. Todd Rose, a psychologist, explains that the human mind cares more about being in the majority, even if we don't care about the group, and even when the group opinion is an illusion. Even without intentional pressure or incentives, we like to go along with consensus because we're biologically wired to do so. People like to say that peer pressure is an explanation for bad behavior, but our minds don't even require that. We just have to see what other people are doing and we copy them. But as this verse states, we can be transformed to the ways of God and morality. And this is what the Jesuits used to cause change. We're going to get to that, I promise. But this is what the Jesuits used to cause change. They created a belief that the majority believed the one way and everybody went along with them. The human mind is more likely to believe a pretty lie than a harsh truth. And if you want them to go along with the scheme, all you have to do is create the illusion of being the majority, whether that's real or not. There is another example called the Milgram experiment. This is the machine here, and this is the man. In the 1960s, Stanley Milgram, he was a psychologist at Yale, he set up an experiment in which test subjects were to administer a shock to another test subject when the second subject answered a question incorrectly. Now, the second test subject really was not a subject. He was part of the experiment, and he was behind a curtain, and he was not actually being shocked. They hooked him up to this machine. When the test subject would push a button, he would hear like sound like that, and they think the person was being shocked, and the person might say something, make a sound, or something like that. But the more the more incorrect answers, the more powerful the shock. If we get an answer wrong, they turn it up, and the next time he'd get a stronger shock, up to the point that it was causing great bodily harm, including him saying, I think I'm having a heart attack, and the person still hit the button. Most of the test subjects continued to administer the shocks because the authority figure told them to do so. Now, the CIA used these experiments, among others, to create their programs such as MK Ultra and its successor programs, but this is the way the human mind is wired. This is why we have the warnings in the Bible to transform ourselves through the power of God. One more experiment, uh, and I can't remember where this one took place, but they had test subjects would go into a room to view a video and make notes about the video. Well, on the way into the room, they would pass by a maintenance worker who was working, and while they were watching the video, the maintenance worker would stage a loud accident with a bang and a cry of pain. Like he would fall off the ladder, and the ladder would go on the floor, and he'd go, "Oh!" When the test subjects were alone, 100% of the time, they jumped up to go check on the maintenance worker to make sure he was okay. However, they then changed the test, and they put other test subjects in there that weren't really test subjects. They were part of the test. And their job was to remain seated after the stage accident. And in almost every case, when the maintenance worker fell and the test subject would look up and see everybody else remaining seated and ignoring the accident, the test subject would remain seated, go along with the crowd. This was the psychological equivalent of a sin of omission. It was just simply following the crowd, what we're warned against. As human beings, our inclination is to go along with the crowd, and it makes us vulnerable to being easily manipulated by propaganda. And Satan is the king of propaganda. He's also a master theologian. But this inclination can be used by those who want to control you, including politicians, corporations, and religious leaders. Most cults are based upon the Bible, but they twist some doctrine in a way that manipulates people. Many politicians manipulate human feelings and weaknesses. Many megachurches create congregations of thousands in the same way. Not all of them create it this way, but many of them do. But they all do it by manufacturing illusions of consensus. It's all spiritual. And things that are in your mind are spiritual. Our mind is not in our heads. Our mind is not in our brains. It's out there somewhere. Our brains are simply, for lack of a better way of describing it, they're like a radio receiver that focuses our mind here. In other words, our mind is in the spiritual realm. Our brain makes it so that it interacts here. These people have figured out how to tap into the spiritual in order to affect people. And just because something is spiritual does not mean that it's good. Remember, Satan and his forces are spiritual. They're spiritual beings. The power of public education, the mainstream media, social media, and anything that can be used for influence is harnessed in order to influence people. If they can make it seem as if a viewpoint is a majority viewpoint, then more people will follow. One of the more popular false teachers that I've seen online right now has millions of followers worldwide. But I've watched some of his lessons. It made me kind of nauseous, but he just makes up things completely, as if he's quoting the Bible, not giving translation opinion or an interpretive difference, but just completely making it up out of thin air. But with millions of followers, he must be right, right? That's not right. You may see things like misleading fact checks. They use emotions. They use questionable polls. They'll censor opposing viewpoints. They'll give biased narratives. It's all psychological warfare, and the Bible warns us to beware of it. 2 Timothy 2:15 says, "Study or be diligent to show thyself approved unto God, a workman that needeth not be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth." The NET is a little easier to understand. It says, make every effort to present yourself before God as a proven worker who does not need to be ashamed, teaching the message of truth accurately. If anything truly matters to you, you need to make sure that you're not simply going along with the crowd. You have to be diligent to be a proven worker. Biblically, politically, the two can't really be separated. You have to make a stand. But these illusions lead many people to question their own convictions and simply go along with what they perceive to be popular, even in relation to destructive agendas and ideologies. This is how the Nazis got control. It's why the people didn't stop them, why even the churches didn't stop them. And the churches even went so far as to ignore the bad parts and go along with them until it was too late. A 2020 study showed that 2/3 of Americans are uncomfortable voicing their political opinions in public. And I would wager that that number is even higher for voicing religious opinions. But why? Oh, we don't talk about politics and religion at the dinner table, or politics and religion don't mix. Why not? Matthew 3:12, whose fan is in his hand, and he will thoroughly purge his floor and gather his wheat into the garner, but he will burn up the chaff with unquenchable fire. We need to speak. When he returns, the wheat is going to be separated from the chaff, and we seem to have plenty of chaff. We talk about everything in the world. We watch all these perversions. We spend hours binge watching things that we have no business watching, but then we are afraid to voice our political and religious opinions. Most don't feel comfortable voicing their opinions in public, but beyond that, if you're seen as conforming in public, others who may be on the fence, they're going to assume that you're agreeing with what you're conforming to. Silence is agreement. That's a sin of omission. And this makes it easier for the collective illusions to spread throughout the entire society. You're the problem when you're silent. When you're silent, you're helping to create the social lie that others will conform because you're approving of it. You're helping to perpetuate what you know to be a lie when you remain silent. And eventually, it becomes impossible to destroy the illusion. This collective illusion is what will make the tyranny possible and what will give it power. In communist Czechoslovakia, the tyranny didn't even have to use that much coercive power to maintain control. They would enforce businesses to hang signs in their windows that said, "Workers of the world unite," communist slogan. Nobody believed those signs, but because the ones who had resisted had been persecuted, usually killed or at least sent to the prison camps, they would hang them up just to go along with it. They didn't want to do anything hard. They didn't believe the signs, but they didn't know what the others didn't believe. Nobody spoke up. By everybody hanging this sign, it reinforced the collective illusion that the majority approved, which created compliance by the masses. And because of this compliance, they didn't have to spend a lot of effort enforcing it, because a few were persecuted and many others feared the dissent. What finally caused change in Czechoslovakia was that a few people stopped hanging the signs and they quit voting in the fraudulent elections and started expressing their real opinions. This started a ripple effect, which, in spite of persecution of the few, led to too many people who were tired of the oppression, and they forced change. Once the first sign came down, it took a total of 11 days to bring down the government. 11 days and the whole facade came down. It was called the Velvet Revolution because it was a completely peaceful revolution that toppled an oppressive and tyrannical regime. The last communist leader, his name was Václav Havel, he helped usher in this change. He was the leader and he helped bring in the change, and then he was elected the first president of the free nation. Interestingly, he was also a playwright, so he may have been simply acting either before or after, but either way, the end result was good. He helped to show that it's possible to live within the truth instead of living within the lie. And this same type of soft revolution also led to perestroika in the Soviet Union. When Mikhail Gorbachev came to a grocery store in Houston, I think it was an HEB. If you're from Houston, you're going to know about HEB. But he saw the availability of food beyond his wildest dreams. And he initiated a series of market-like reforms, which eventually led to a much freer place. In both cases, the leader led the revolution. And in this instance, is because he came here and he saw the handwriting on the wall. Humans are social beings. What we say and do influences others. Even minor displays of noncompliance and nonconformity can create a butterfly effect that changes society in a major way. This can be a positive or negative way, but it doesn't take much to change. And that's why we need to be prepared to speak politically or religiously or both. Alexander Solzhenitsyn said, "The simple step of a courageous individual is not to take part in the lie. One word of truth outweighs the world." John 17:17 says, "Sanctify them through thy word. Thy word is truth." As Christians, we're not of this world, but we are in this world, and we can be cowards or we can speak truth. We each have a choice, and not choosing is not an option. By not choosing, you're choosing the wrong option. We may face social, physical, or economic repercussions for being too forthright and speaking the truth, but we can use the strategy of sowing seeds of doubt in the minds of others. Our public education no longer teaches as we've seen, and there's a reason for that. If we understand logic, reason, and rhetoric, then we can spread truth using words that are less direct. If you read the Bible and you know history, it's glaringly obvious that Jesus, Paul, and the writer of the fourth gospel are all very familiar with Aristotelian and other philosophical rhetoric, and they use such to convey ideas and information in a rational way. In other words, you can say, well, on the one hand, I can see this, but on the other hand, I can see that. And this is probably true in many instances. I know that there are many things about which I'm not certain, but this argument can still give ideas to others. Or I have a friend who's had this certain experience. Even if I've not had them, I can use those stories. Or things that you've read, stories in the news, although the news is getting more questionable as artificial intelligence gets better at faking things. But suggesting other options will give you plausible deniability while still having your sense of control of the situation. It also gives an opening to others who have been afraid to speak up. One spark can start a great fire. Your indirect works can give others courage to follow. Um, the Bible's use of Greek philosophy is not necessarily an endorsement of any ideas that any of them voiced, the Greek philosophers. In fact, sometimes they're directly opposed to specific ideas, but the methods of discussing are important. Aristotle, Socrates, Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, and others, they can be beneficial to your thoughts, even if you disagree with the conclusions. The thought process is still valid, and God wants us to think. If you choose not to speak up, you're a hypocrite and a coward. The Bible tells us that. When you comply with tyrannical mandates, ideologies, agendas, and laws, you're not going to be a victim if you comply. Well, technically, you'll be a victim, but you're an active supporter. You're a victim of yourself. As Havel pointed out, people didn't have to believe the lies. They only had to behave as though they believed the lies, or they have to simply tolerate them. And tolerance is not really a virtue in the modern sense, biblically, but by acting like they believed the lies, they had to live within that lie. And if you ever see a church with social justice as part of their doctrinal statement, you need to run as fast as you can. Social justice, the way it's used today, is contrary to biblical justice, and that church is promoting a lie. There is no need to accept the lie as being true. You must only accept your life within the lie in order to be part of the problem. And if you do that, you're a coward. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 9 through 12. Even him whose coming is after the working of Satan with all power and signs and lying wonders, and with all deceivableness of unrighteousness in them that perish, because they receive not the love of the truth, that they might be saved. And for this cause God shall send them strong delusion, that they should believe the lie, that they all might be condemned or damned, who believed not the truth, but had pleasure in unrighteousness. In John 8:44, you're of your father the devil, and the lust of your fathers you will do. He was a murderer from the beginning and abode not in the truth because there's no truth in him. When he speaks a lie, he speaks of his own, for he is a liar and the father of it. People don't have to believe a lie in order to live that lie. And if you're a coward, what you're doing is confirming the system, you're making the system, and you're fulfilling the system. You are the system. And this is a system of lies. It's the kingdom of Satan, the kingdom of the fallen angels, the Nephilim, and everybody who allies themselves with these dark forces and powers. In Ephesians 4:25, wherefore putting away lying, speak every man truth with his neighbor, for we are members one of another. Romans 3:3 through 6. This is from the NET Bible. It's a little bit easier to understand than the King James. What then? If some did not believe, does their unbelief nullify the faithfulness of God? Absolutely not. Let God be proven true, and every human being shown up as a liar, just as it's written, so that you will be justified in your words and will prevail when you are judged. But if our unrighteousness demonstrates the righteousness of God, what shall we say? The God who inflicts wrath is not unrighteous, is he? I'm speaking in human terms. Absolutely not. For otherwise, how could God judge the world? And you can be most certainly assured that God will judge the world. Acts 17:31. Because he hath appointed a day in the which he will judge the world in unrighteousness by that man whom he hath ordained, whereof he hath given assurance unto all men, and that he hath raised him from the dead. Back to our passage in Revelation 21. He that overcometh shall inherit all things, and I will be his God, and he shall be my son. But the cowardly and unbelieving, and the detestable persons, and murderers, and sexually immoral, and sorcerers, and idolaters, and all liars shall have their part in the lake which burneth with fire and brimstone, which is the second death. As individuals, we are also going to be judged individually at the judgment seat of Christ. If we're cowards, that's going to be less than an ideal outcome for us. Or if we're unfaithful, or if we're detestable, or if we're murderers, or if we're sexually immoral, or if we're involved with mind altering drugs, or an idolater, or a liar, the list is long. Now is the time to follow the example of Jesus. Now is the time to be an actual Christian, somebody who acts Christ-like. Then it will be too late. But how are so many people deceived? Proverbs 12:15 says, the way of a fool is right in his own eyes, but he that hearkeneth unto counsel is wise. This word fool is a stupid person. I always taught my kids to never be afraid to ask a stupid question. People don't like to feel stupid. They don't like to feel foolish, so they often don't want to ask a question that seems stupid. However, no matter how stupid the question, if you need to know the answer and you don't know the answer, ask advice from somebody who knows. That's how you keep from being stupid, by getting an answer to your question. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, on the 10th anniversary of Hitler's rise to power, he sent a circular letter to three friends who were also involved in the conspiracy against Hitler. These were the ones who were not cowards. In the letter, he stated, stupidity is a more dangerous enemy of the good than malice. In other words, people are often stupid. Now, stupidity has nothing to do with your mental ability. A good definition of stupidity is a lack of wisdom, discernment, or understanding, particularly in moral and spiritual matters. It has nothing to do with their mental abilities, it has to do with how you use it. Proverbs 12:1 says, whoso loves instruction or whoso loves discipline loves knowledge, but he that hates reproof is brutish. And this is stupid. If you hate reproof, then you're stupid. Yeah, I want to read this entire letter. I've got a link to this letter below. You can download it and look at it later. I want to read the whole letter real quick here, then we'll come to a close. But stupidity is a more dangerous enemy of the good than malice. One may protest against evil. It can be exposed and, if need be, prevented by the use of force. Evil always carries within itself the germ of its own subversion, in that it leaves behind in human beings at least a sense of unease. And what he's saying here is people know that it's wrong, they're uneasy about it. But against stupidity, we're defenseless. Neither protest nor the use of force accomplish anything here. Reason falls on deaf ears. Facts that contradict one's prejudgment simply need not be believed. In such moments, the stupid person even becomes critical, and when facts are irrefutable, they're just pushed aside as inconsequential, as incidental. In all this, the stupid person, in contrast to the malicious one, is utterly self satisfied, and being easily irritated becomes dangerous by going on the attack. For that reason, greater caution is called for than with the malicious one. Never again will we try to persuade the stupid ones with reasons, for it is senseless and dangerous. If we want to know how to get the better of stupidity, we must seek to understand its nature. This much is certain, that it is in essence not an intellectual defect, but a human one. There are human beings who are of remarkably agile intellect, yet they're stupid, and others who are intellectually quite dull, yet anything but stupid. We discover this to our surprise in particular situations. The impression one gains is not so much that stupidity is a congenital defect, but that under certain circumstances people are made stupid or that they allow this to happen to them. In other words, he's saying they're intelligent but stupid. People are born ignorant, but they're educated into stupidity. Then he goes on to say, we note further that people who have isolated themselves from others or who live in solitude manifest this defect less frequently than individuals or groups of people inclined or condemned to sociability. And so it would seem that stupidity is perhaps less a psychological than a sociological problem. It's a particular form of the impact of historical circumstances on human beings, a psychological concomitant, which is a fancy way of existing concurrently with something else. But it's a psychological concomitant of certain external conditions. Upon closer observation, it becomes apparent that every strong upsurge of power in the public sphere, be it of a political or of a religious nature, infects a large part of humankind with stupidity. It would even seem that this is virtually a sociological, psychological law. The power of the one needs the stupidity of the other. The process at work here is not the particular human capacities, for instance, the intellect, suddenly atrophy or fail. Instead, it seems that under the overwhelming impact of rising power, humans are deprived of their interdependence and more or less consciously give up establishing an autonomous position toward the emerging circumstances. In other words, what he's saying is they follow the crowd. God told us to avoid the cities. This is why. Then he goes on to say the fact that the stupid person is often stubborn must not blind us to the fact that he is not independent. In conversation with him, one virtually feels that one is dealing not at all with a person, but with slogans, catchwords, and the like that have taken possession of him. He's under a spell. He's blinded, misused, and abused in his very being. Having thus become a mindless tool, the stupid person will also be capable of any evil and at the same time incapable of seeing that it's evil. This is where the danger of diabolical misuse lurks, for it is this that can once and for all destroy human beings. Yet at this very point, it becomes quite clear that only an act of liberation, not instruction, can overcome stupidity. Here we must come to terms with the fact that in most cases, a genuine internal liberation becomes possible only when external liberation has preceded it. This brought to my mind John 8:32, which says, "And you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." But then he continues on, until then, we must abandon all attempts to convince a stupid person. This state of affairs explains why, in such circumstances, our attempts to know what the people really think are in vain, and why, under these circumstances, this question is so irrelevant for the person who is thinking and acting responsibly. The word of the Bible that the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom declares that the internal liberation of human beings to live the responsible life before God is the only genuine way to overcome stupidity. But these thoughts about stupidity also offer consolation in that they utterly forbid us to consider the majority of the people to be stupid in every circumstance. It really will depend on whether those in power expect more from people's stupidity than from their inner independence and wisdom. I would encourage you to download this letter and take a look at it later. Hope you don't mind that I read it to you there. But in the 1970s, there was an Italian economic historian named Carlo, I think his last name is pronounced Cipolla, and he developed the 5 laws of human stupidity. There's a link below to this book. It's a little short book. But the term itself is not a description of intellectual ability, but of social responsibility. He said the stupid ones are more fearsome than mafia, the military industrial complex, or the Communist International. They're an unorganized group without a leader or norm, but in spite of that, they act in perfect harmony as guided by an invisible hand. He also said, with a smile on his lips, as if he were doing the most natural thing in the world, the stupid will appear on the spur of the moment to spoil your plans, destroy your peace, complicate your life and work, make you lose money, time, good humor, productivity, and all this without malice, without remorse, and without reason, stupidly. Once again, this has nothing to do with basic intelligence. I've known geniuses who are stupid, and I've known those who were not so bright who were not stupid. In this person's analysis, a stupid person is somebody who causes losses to another person or group while he himself gains nothing, and perhaps himself even incurs losses, vandals. If both parties gain, it's not stupid. Stupidity is not dependent upon any other characteristic of ethnicity, sex, economic status, and especially not education. The frequency of stupidity in a group is not dependent upon the size of the group. It's a social phenomenon. It's a spontaneous mob mentality. And although he wrote this, I think he wrote this in the 70s, it very much echoes what Bonhoeffer wrote in his letter and reflects what we're told in the book of Proverbs. We will always underestimate how many stupid people there are in a group, and those who are in power will use these people to full advantage. They're dangerous because reasonable people don't understand unreasonable behavior unless they pay attention to it and study it, and even then, they may be surprised. Somebody who is not stupid can understand the logic of a malicious person because while evil, his actions are rational. He wants to gain from it. These are people at the very heart of good mystery novels. But a stupid person will cause problems just because they can. There's no rational way to tell when, how, or why a stupid person might attack because they're irrational. You can't mount a rational defense on irrationality. Look at what's going on in the Middle East right now. Today was in the news. Israel just had peace. They just signed a peace treaty with Hamas. I think 2 days ago, 3 days ago, and today Hamas attacked them again, broke the peace treaty already. Completely irrational. They were being destroyed. And although technically it's predictable because they have a history of the same type of irrationality, but it makes no sense that they would do that. They were given a reprieve and then they attacked. But if non-stupid people fail to constantly remember that under any circumstances, dealing with stupid people will always turn out to be a costly mistake. Yet so many people feel mercy and compassion for these victims of circumstance, what they call it. They feel such compassion that they will enable them to hurt themselves or even hurt others. Left-wing politics teaches that if they're given a sense of self-worth, then they will overcome their stupidity. If we give them education, I say give them education, we lower standards so that they can get a diploma, or if we give them life experiences for which they're not prepared, these people believe that they will cease being stupid. And this is the heart of initiatives that take place in the government today and in corporations. It's not about equality, it's about equity, which is inherently unjust and it's used for demonic purposes. They think that giving people these things will make them quit being stupid. Our society makes it possible for them to determine our laws and to enforce them. People who are stupid, they don't need to be making laws. This leads to the eventual downfall of society. We've seen this in the past through history, but we don't learn from history. We see examples of this failing every single day, and the results are devastating. Death and destruction follow in the footsteps of these misguided attempts to fix the results of stupidity without fixing the cause of stupidity. And the same is true in the church as it is in the world today. 2 Timothy 3:5 says, "For if a man know not how to rule his own house, how shall he take care of the church of God?" Those who would be overseers within the church, they must first demonstrate that they can manage their own households well. They may have had past problems. After all, Paul had been a murderer, but they must show that they are currently and consistently managing well. They must make intelligent choices to benefit others as well as themselves. They must make ethical choices, and they have to show that they have a servant's heart. And instead, we put all sorts of ungodly people full of ungodly perversions in charge of our congregations, and then we wonder why the church is weak and cowardly. And in the case of Bonhoeffer, it shows why the German church failed to stop Hitler. They became weak. Isaiah chapter 30, verse 21. If you listen, and thine ear shall hear a word behind thee saying, "This is the way, walk you in it, when you turn to the right hand and when you turn to the left." We have to live a life of prayer, and we must listen for the answer in order to hear. And I know that we've not started on the details of the Jesuits yet, and we're out of time. I went over again. Sorry about that. But we've seen how a small group can make great changes, and we've started looking at why people would follow blindly. Next week, we're going to look at how our people got to this point of mass stupidity and why this group would want to take over the Catholic Church structure. And then we're going to look at details on the Jesuits and what they've done. But as we close tonight, I want to leave a closing thought from Bonhoeffer. Action springs not from thought, but from a readiness for responsibility. The ultimate test of a moral society is the kind of world that it leaves to its children. I want you to think about that. And we're going to part on that for now, and I'll see you next week.